Well, good morning. I think it's working. I'm sorry I'm a little late. Once again, the vagaries of Facebook Live, or at least my inability to handle it very well. Let me turn this off. All right. Well, good morning. Make sure I've got everything. Uh, this is public. All right. Very good. Forgive me. Again, my production team slept in this morning, so I'm on my own. Actually, I am my own production plan. Our team. Well, again, good morning and welcome to session number 16 by my count in a teaching series on the life and ministry of Jesus. During the Easter season, just now behind us, we focused on the events of Jesus' death and burial and resurrection, the Passion Week itself. And then on the importance of Jesus' 40-day post-resurrection ministry, his ascension to the Father, and then, of course, the inauguration of the new covenant ministry of the Holy Spirit, which inauguration occurred in connection with the Feast of Pentecost, told us in Acts chapter 2. But now, in the time remaining of our pervasive pandemic paralysis, if you don't mind, that has been visited upon us, we're going to turn our thoughts to some elements of the biblical narrative of Jesus' life, which again, by my lights, are really pivotal and deserve special attention. And this morning, I would like us to focus on the Nativity of Jesus, the Christmas story. Here we are just coming out of the Easter season, but we're going to kind of work our way chronologically as much time as we have through some of the very important events and narratives. And it's certainly appropriate to begin with the story of the Nativity of our Lord. It's a story with which we are very, very familiar, and so we're kind of treading on sacred ground. But what I'll come to that in just a moment. First of all, two introductory notes. First of all, and this is by way of this is from the mind and heart of a teacher. Let me just say that to understand the life of Jesus, and quite frankly, to understand the New Testament narrative in all of its parts, it's absolutely imperative that you come to know, it really is, that you get familiar with not only the Old Testament and the narrative there, because that is the basis upon which everything proceeds forward in the New Testament, but also it's important to get to know the intertestamental period. Now, I'm not going to spend time on this. I just want to whet your appetite a little bit. And these 400 silent years, now they're called the silent years because the Bible does not record them, but they are anything but inactive or unconsequential. They are hugely important years. It's called the intertestamental period. It's from Malachi to Matthew. So at the end of Malachi, a promise is given that God is going to send Elijah before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. And the next time God breaks through and speaks is 400 years later or so, when a humble but righteous priest by the name of Zacharias is ministering in the holy place, and an angel appears to him and tells him, Zacharias, that he and his aged wife Elizabeth are going to bear a son, and he's going to be the voice crying in the wilderness. So those 400 years between Malachi and Matthew, between the prophet Malachi and the man Nehemiah in the Old Testament, and then the beginning of the New Testament revelation with the announcement of the birth of John, those 400 years in so many ways set the scene. And it's so important. And I'm going to say again, how many times are you going to bring this up when I know, but our faith is grounded in history. And it's a historical narrative that happened in a real place. And it happened amidst that historical biblical narrative, happened amidst all the other events, and interacted and was interconnected with all that was going on around it in terms of history. So it's so very, very important. When you read a fairy tale, you don't have to study history. Who cares? But this isn't a fairy tale. This is real history. And, I always say, where in the New Testament do you read about synagogues? I'm sorry, back up. Where in the Old Testament do you read about synagogues? You do not. And yet they're all over the place in Jewish life in the New Testament. Where'd they come from? Intertestamental period. Where do you read about Pharisees, Sadducees. You don't read about those in the Old Testament, and yet they are dominant and really, really principal players in the narrative of the New Testament. Where they come from? Intertestamental period. When you close the pages of the Old Testament, who is ruling? It's Persia. They've allowed the Jews to come back. Cyrus has made a decree allowing the Jews to come back, and they've rebuilt their temple under Zerubbabel, and then their city under Nehemiah. That's where you close the page of the Old Testament. They are a satrap they are a governing province under the rule of Persia. When you open the new pages, the pages of the New Testament, who is ruling? It's Rome. What happened? Persia, Rome, and besides that, in between, there has been Greece and the Seleucids and so on. So there are so many ways. Now, I'm going to make a couple of recommendations very, very quickly, because you can go online, you can look up intertestamental period between the testaments, a lot of phrases given to it and so on. And there's good material and so on. I would recommend two resources to you. I haven't done much of this. But the one is, and I love this work. It's called the Satellite Bible Atlas, and it is such a treasure. And you can go online to toddbolinsbibleplaces.com. I believe you can still get it there. You can get it at Amazon. But the Satellite Bible Atlas by Bill Schlegel. Now, Schlegel is a dear friend of mine. I'm going to say very delicately, very quickly, that he has been a disappointment to almost all of his friends in the last couple of years, because quite frankly, he rather abandoned the Orthodox Christian faith. But he was a colleague for many years, and this is a really, really helpful work. So he had not embraced any heresy when he wrote this. But having said it, what it is, Satellite Bible Atlas, and it's worth reading. It's as good a Bible survey as I think you're going to find. It's fascinating because what he does is he gives you a map, and then, I got to get the map there. He gives you a map, and then on the facing page, he gives you he explains whatever narrative he's dealing with. And he has just about 6 pages on the intertestamental period. It's his section 8, and this is such a good resource. And Bill has a real gift of pulling out what is really significant, especially historically. So you'd enjoy that. It's not cheap, but it's very, very reasonable, and I would so encourage you to get it. One other resource, and that is a book by J. Dwight Pentecost on Words and Works of Jesus Christ. This was his magnum opus, as it were, on his Life of Christ course that he taught at Dallas Seminary for decades and decades, and huge, huge impact, very, very important voice in this regard. But he has an appendix on the intertestamental period. It's about 50 pages, but he really pulls out. You can buy there are all sorts of sources. Any Bible survey that you may have a New Testament survey book on your shelf from days gone by. You pull it off, there's a section on the intertestamental period. So you don't have to get these, but there are a couple of sources if you don't have one. But I'm just saying that in so many ways, and let me just real quickly, I told myself it'd be quick. The influence of the Greeks, Persia, which was ruling when the Old Testament closes, was destroyed by Alexander the Great in Greece. And I'm not going to get into it other than to say this, that Alexander and the Greeks after him imposed Greek culture on the world they conquered. And that imposition of Greek culture is called Hellenization. And let me tell you something, that Hellenization is the most important, defining, and disrupting issue in Jewish life in the first century. The Pharisees are fighting against, this is oversimplified, but it really comes to the heart of things. The Pharisees resist Hellenization, embracing things Greco-Roman, burning a little incense to a Greek and then later a Roman god, enjoying all of the entertainments and recreation and so on that was so pivotal and central to Roman life. All of that Hellenization, Hellos is the Greek word for Greece, and so the imposition of Greek culture, it just absolutely defines and divides Jewish culture, and interestingly, then and now. Now, I won't get into it, but I will say this. I think it's fair to say that day by day, the most challenging division in the culture of the land of Israel today is not Arab versus Jew, it's religious Jew versus secular Jew. And to that degree, it is stunning the degree to which, in that regard, it's stunning the degree to which the more things change, the more they stay the same. But this idea of Hellenization and the way it bleeds into and colors the narrative throughout the New Testament and so on is so very important. You read the book of Acts, and a couple of times, well, I'll just leave it at that. I'll get to making illustrations and I'll lose so much time. But the Greeks, and then of course, in the latter days of the Greek Empire, Alexander died. His kingdom was divided four ways per Daniel chapter 8, and just as prophesied. And two of those divisions were the Seleucids in Syria to the north of Israel, and the Ptolemies in Egypt to the south, and their football and their struggle. And the Seleucids, latter-day Seleucid by the name of Antiochus IV, imposes horribly draconian restrictions and basically tries to outlaw the Jewish religion, burning synagogues, burning Torah scrolls, ultimately, of course, burning a pig on the altar in Jerusalem. And he sparks a revolt led by a family named the Hasmoneans, and their nickname is the Maccabees. And you have the Maccabean revolt, and now the Maccabees take over. They're able to drive the Syrians out finally, and you have this dynasty of Jewish priests who take way too much of themselves and actually fall in love with things Greek ultimately, or not very ultimately, quite quickly. And so now along come the Romans. The Romans have to displace the Hasmoneans, and they appoint a young Idumean prince, almost the son of a very important Idumean leader, Edomite, that is, son of Esau, and his name is Herod the Great. And Herod the Great does in fact conquer the Hasmoneans, and by the time you open the page of the New Testament, we get just a glimpse of Herod as he tries to kill the Christ child. And so in so many ways, what I'm saying, and taking too much time saying it is, folks, spend time to get to know the intertestamental period. That's just, it's the historical setting is all important. And in so many ways, those 400 years shape the narrative we encounter when we come to the New Testament. All right, that's note number one. A second note real quickly, and then we're going to go to the nativity narrative, and that is simply this, folks. I'm going to say again, and this won't be the last time as God's sweet providences allow us to be together in this fashion. I'm going to say again how important it is in all of our dealings with the life of Jesus as recorded in the gospel that we take very seriously his genuine humanity, unfallen humanity, but genuine humanity. And I spent some time with this in one of the very early lectures. I think it was the first or second in this series. And you could perhaps refer to that if you've not seen it, just to set a frame of reference, because again, in all of our dealings, and especially early on here, I think it's going to be so important to once again disabuse our minds and hearts rather deliberately of the Clark Kent syndrome, to recalibrate to whatever degree is necessary our minds, so that as we read this, we acknowledge the mystery. We're not going to figure out what it means for the Word to become flesh. The Word became flesh. But both sides of that, the eternal second person of the triune Godhead, who John has identified as the Word, the eternal God, it became flesh. And that's real human nature. So he took upon himself all that is intrinsic to unfallen human nature, and thus he's going to live a real life, and he's going to be born as a baby, totally helpless, and so on. And that's where we're going to pick it up. So I'm going to turn our thoughts then to the nativity of Jesus, and very specifically, I'm going to try and hurry myself. This, folks, the reason I let me just say, it's unspeakably important to read the Bible in terms of its own culture, and not to take our culture into the Bible. And it seems to me that in the nativity narrative, there are several specific points where I think it would be good. I am going to suggest, yea, verily, I'm going to press you. I'm going to suggest that you recalibrate your understanding of the nativity narrative on 3 counts. And rethink the nativity narrative on these 3 counts. And let me begin with Isaiah chapter 53, because let me go here. Hold on here. in Isaiah 53, very, very familiar, you have the servant song. And it begins back here in verse 13, and we're told about the suffering and so on, and this is the servant who is going to suffer. But I just want to start with chapter 53 and verse 1, where Isaiah says, "Who has believed our report?" Now, what he means by that is this: we have been taught since Genesis chapter 3, Adam, in his immediately after his fall, we have been taught to look for a redeemer, and our hearts have been heavy, and our souls have been longing for this promised one who could deliver us from the curse of sin and death. And who could believe that when he arrives, there'll be no beauty that we should desire him, that he'll be despised. That's what he's saying. Who can believe this? Isaiah, writing 700 years before the Lord, and having written many passages in which he exults over the glory and the majesty and the justice of the reign of this coming king, and he longed for the deliverance that this king was going to bring. Now he says, who could believe this? That when he gets here, there'll be no form nor comeliness. We won't desire him. Well, now listen, when you read that passage, and certainly the entire passage, I think it's entirely appropriate, and the intent of Isaiah, that your mind go primarily to the cross. I want us to bring the same spirit for just a few moments to the cradle. Because, and here's where I want to take you, it seems to me that there is an element of the story that would jump off the page of Matthew and Luke. We have these two nativity narratives, Matthew and Luke, and as you read them, and then even as you read other related passages that remember Jesus' life, and specifically his coming to this world as a baby, that what would jump off the pages to you, if you read it in terms of its own narrative, is a level of shame and ignominy and anger and embarrassment that we miss. And so I'm going to suggest three specific elements of the narrative that I'd like you to kind of rethink. And I think as you do so, perhaps it will recalibrate your understanding of this story, and I think make it, I trust, the more meaningful. But again, this isn't just Bookman's telling, for heaven's sakes. My point is simply that I think we've allowed our culture to impinge, and our nativity sets. And we got one, we put it out every year, fine. But I'm just saying that we kind of extrapolate the myths and the modern traditions, and even what comes out of our culture, and I'll show you that in just a minute, to cover the story. So let me take you back to the story. And quite frankly, again, I'm going to be very simple. Three ways in which I'd ask you to rethink the nativity narrative. It's a little dangerous because this is one of your favorite narratives, and you've known it since childhood and told it to your own children and so on. But let me just ask you. All right, so number one has to do with the relationship of Joseph and Mary when the angel came to Mary. Now, there's a lot more to what I'm trying to say here than simply this. But we have to get past this idea, entirely born of our culture, that they were engaged or that they were pledged. In fact, here's the simple reality: Joseph and Mary were man and wife. They were married. Now, you have to understand, and this is I think I may have mentioned to you before, because it comes to my mind again and again, that it's so important to read the Bible in terms of its own culture, and to do that, you have to study this culture. You have to study the culture of the Bible in any way you can, and do it deliberately. But the point, it's a winsome, marvelous culture. It's a recoverable culture. It's a culture which still exists in many startling ways in other parts of the world, but it's very foreign to our culture. And one area of the culture which is so different and so worthy of our study, because it shows up so often, is the business of marriage. Now, let me just say that in Jewish culture, even today, in Orthodox culture, there are two stages to a marriage, and they're separated by weeks and months. And those two stages are the betrothal and the wedding. And so at the betrothal, the contract is signed by which this young man and this young woman are going to become at that moment, when they sign the betrothal in the presence of witnesses, they become man and wife. They are married. On the other hand, they don't live together. As a matter of fact, it's very important that they maintain their purity throughout the period of the betrothal until they are finally wed, because this is what it looks like. Uh, Basically, as I said, matter of fact, before I do that, all right, I'm swimming in my mind here. Let me take you back to the scriptures, and I want to show you. I just make my case here, and I'm not beating up on anybody, but here I have Matthew chapter 1 and verse 18. Now this is where you have. As it says there, Matthew 1:18, the birth of Jesus Christ was as follows. After his mother Mary was betrothed to Joseph before they came together. Now there is just a world of societal, well, I mean to finish. After she was betrothed, before they came together, she was found with child. Now there is just such a store of cultural, emotional angst and just really gripping emotions and so on in that little phrase, but we don't get it because we tend to think of it in several ways. But I think we bring a wrong perspective to this in several counts. But let me just deal with this: that here you have Matthew 1:18. Oh, I had this all set up. Just a second here. Yes, here, Matthew 1:18. Now, let me show you several translations. I'm going to go through these rather quickly. But here is the New International Version. She was pledged to be married. Now, they did, in their original versions, have engaged, but they got beat up for it. It pledged to be married. But if you're pledged to be married, are you married? No, you're going to get married soon. Now, again, I'm going to take you through these quickly. Here is the New Living Translation. She was engaged to be married. It's just, it's throws everything off. Here is the Holman Christian Standard. I would have expected better here. After his mother Mary had been engaged. Now, he gives us a note here. Jewish engagement was a binding agreement that could only be broken by divorce. In other words, they were married. I always say, what's it take to break an engagement? One bad dinner, right? Or one bad date, for heaven's sakes. You're out of here, bud. On the other hand, what's it take to break a betrothal? It takes a divorce. They are married. They are legally married. Just a couple others here real quickly. I'm driving it. Here's the New Century. Mary was engaged to marry Joseph, does the same thing, says it was binding and so on. So they often give us a note. This is the God's Word translation. She had been promised to Joseph in marriage. See, they're not married yet. I'm going to come back to this later on. And here is the International Standard, and again gives us a long note that says, well, okay, engagement involved a legally binding promise of marriage. Not such a long note. Well, my point is simply this, that if you read most any one of these, especially, for instance, here, when his mother, Mary, had been promised to Joseph, but before they were married. So you get the idea that they were pledged, they were engaged, because that's our culture. Now, folks, that's not Jewish culture. And it really is now, let me go back to what happens. As I say, here, and here's another element, I think I mentioned this before, they lived in clans all throughout Bible times. It's true even today, more than you can appreciate, that in this culture you live as large extended families or clans. So here is one clan over here, and here's another clan over here. You can't see my, but and they have this clan has a young man who is of marriageable age. This clan has a young woman, and someone suggests this young woman over here to this family, and so now someone who is, by the way, knows the groom very well. He knows the man who is going to approach the other clan for the hand of that young woman, knows the young man well, so he can represent. Let me tell you something. In that culture, and there is wisdom in this, you didn't marry a man as much as you married a clan. That is, as you considered a marriage proposal, if you don't mind, from this or that clan, one of the most important considerations was the strength of the clan, because you are going to, your clan is everything. Your clan is your prestige and your security and your wealth and your just in so many ways you're dependent upon your clan. And you want that clan to grow large, by the way. And the only way for that clan to grow is to have babies. And you are going to go to another clan to find a wife. This is why, for instance, I'm spending too much time here, but this is why there was such, quite frankly, and I understand, I've never seen it happen, but I understand, read several places that even today in Orthodox Jewish culture, there is great rejoicing at the birth of a son and rather muted delight at the birth of a daughter. And so I've read where in biblical days, when a woman was giving birth, she would be with the midwives, and the expectant father would be with some of his friends, and if it was a son, they would come out and whisper in the ears of the friends, "It's a son," and they would kind of climb over each other to get to the father and say, "You've had a son, you've had a son." That'd be great rejoicing. If it was a daughter, forgive me, that's not because they didn't love their daughters. I'll come back to this. But they would whisper the same thing, and the groomsmen would kind of just put on their coats and go home and leave the husband behind, the father behind, just because it's not because they didn't love their daughters, but if you bear a daughter, she's going to grow up and she's going to be married into another clan and strengthen that clan, and our clan needs to grow. This is why the bride price that the clan pays, that is the husband's clan, the groom's clan, pays a dowry price. Now, there's a lot to this, and there were a lot of different elements of it, but basically there is a bride price that was paid to reimburse the clan for the effort to raise that young lady and prepare her to come and strengthen our clan. So I say all that just to make this point, that you have these two clans, and this young man makes the offer, sends his, you know what that person was called generally who would go? He's the friend of the bridegroom. And it's important that he's the friend of the bridegroom. That's going to come up in John 3, because he knows the bridegroom well. That's the point. So he can really represent who the man is to the clan of the young woman. So if the clan from which the young woman comes consents, then representatives of the two clans, including some of the leadership and certainly the father of the bride and the father of the groom, come together and they meet before a judge. And now there are variations on this, but basically there is a contract. And the contract spells out all of the bride price and so on, but included in the contract, and this is important, and frankly, there's a lot of confusion about this, and of course, I'm right and everybody else is confused. Okay, I'm a little hubris there, but I think the notion that, all right, I'll just keep going, I'll come back to that. The fact is that the part of the contract was the date of the wedding. Now, you have to understand that there is nothing more important in Jewish culture than a wedding. And if there's a family wedding, now it's not come one, come all in that day any more than it is today, but you invite family first and friends beyond that. And if you're invited, if there's a family wedding, you are invited and you get to a family wedding. Again, I think that wedding in John chapter 2 is a family wedding. It's clear Mary, Jesus' mother, feels some responsibility for that. And she, in point of fact, I think I have this idea. Remember now, I'm asking a lot of you here. I don't even know if we've been over this, but the wedding comes right after. As a matter of fact, if you don't mind, 5 days, because the days are laid out in John 1 and 2. 5 days after Jesus emerges from the wilderness experience, where he's been recovering from a 40-day fast with angelic assistance, and still probably doesn't look real good, he emerges, and 5 days later, he is at that wedding in Cana. And I wonder if maybe during that period of recuperation, as Jesus is gathering his strength, again, with angelic assistance, the Bible makes much of this, angels they can't do miracles. They can't simply speak Jesus into health when they come after that 40-day fast. They minister to him for some weeks. But the point is that I just wonder if Jesus didn't say to those angels, thank you so much, but I have a wedding I got to get to. And I wonder if they might have said, are you sure you're ready for this? Are you strong enough? I think Jesus might have said, I've got to get to this wedding. And Mary would have been disappointed if Jesus had not shown up at this wedding. And so I say that's a totally aside, but I want you to understand that in that culture, you get to a wedding. So the point is that you set the date for the wedding. Now, the betrothal, and it cannot be more than a year, but it's usually several months off. Now, here's the important thing. During the betrothal period, the wife has a responsibility, and that is, quite frankly, to make herself beautiful for the wedding day. They're already married, they're man and wife, but they have not yet had the wedding. So they're going to be separate. Many times, by the way, well, let me go further. So her responsibility is to make herself beautiful, to gather her trousseau, to make herself ready to leave the home of her youth and her parents and make her way to the home which the groom is preparing, because that's his responsibility, to prepare a home for them to move into. Now, let me just say that I believe that Mary and Joseph were probably mid to late teens. Again, I go back to it. Your intent is to you need your clan to grow, and so when young people get of age where they can have babies, why, you marry them. And the other thing to say is this, that here's another place where you've got to really recalibrate your head with regard to their culture vis-a-vis ours. Uh, Listen, I often said, and this is the grandfather speaking, but it seems to me we take the leave part of leave and cleave a little too seriously, in the sense that we think, okay, you're on your own now. That's not the way it was. And when God said you'll leave and cleave your wife, the idea is that your primary allegiance and focus in life will be to your wife as opposed to your parents. But in that culture, you stayed a part of the clan. And one of the expressions used for marrying is to add a room to your father's tent. So that's kind of the idea. Hey, young man, about time you added a room to your daddy's tent. And all you meant was you're going to take some goat hair. And so now this is when they were more nomadic. I don't think this is the first century life in Nazareth. But the fact is that it bespeaks the fact that you're really just going to move in and be part of that clan, and you're going to bring wife with you. So I finished the thought. During the period of the betrothal, several months, and it's been established, it is the responsibility of the bride to prepare herself. And one might say, make herself beautiful for the wedding day, the wedding march. And it's the responsibility of the groom to prepare a home to which he will fetch his wife in the wedding march. And then together, it is the responsibility of the two of them to maintain their purity, their physical, sexual purity. And in that culture, as in this, it might be the more of a temptation now that they are legally wed. And so, in many cases, it might be a temptation to be careless in that regard. And so, in many cases, the bride would absent herself. And this is what Mary does. She goes to spend about 3 months after the announcement. She goes and spends time after the betrothal, is the important thing, spends time with her cousin Elizabeth down in a town in the hill country of Judea. Elizabeth, of course, is pregnant with the baby who will grow up to be John the Baptist. All right, so you have the wedding. I'm sorry. You have the betrothal, and then sometime later you have the wedding. I should do it this way. You have the betrothal, then sometime later. The point is this: that during that time, that period of the betrothal, they remain separate. Now, let me tell you what the wedding is like. And I'm taking physically, they maintain their physical purity very carefully. It's unspeakably, biblically, appropriately important. Now, the wedding is quite simple, except it's not. The wedding, all that happens with the wedding is that the groom goes to the home of the bride and fetches her to the home that he has prepared for them as a couple. And so he just goes and gets his bride. Now there'll often be, people point out, maybe a bit of a supper there at the bride's home before they set up, and now they make their way. Now, I said it's simple. Whatever ceremony, whatever exchange of tokens, like a ring, there is in this whole exchange happens at the betrothal. The betrothal is the formal settling of the marriage relationship. But the wedding is just, you go and you fetch your bride and you take her, and then there is a feast in the home that the groom has prepared. But it's not quite that simple, because as they make their way through the streets, the and again, depending upon the wealth of the families and so on, there will be musicians, there will be dancers, there will be young children, there will be poets and so on. There'll be scattering flower petals, whatever in the world you can imagine. But they make their way, they win the way through the town, and everybody rejoices. Even if you're not going to be at the wedding feast, you rejoice. One of the curious distinctions culturally between biblical culture and our culture is that in our culture it's important to restrain emotions, especially sorrow, but even in that culture, obviously, and you see this even with modern expressions of sorrow in that culture, it's very important to wail and carry on in sorrow, and it's very important to dance and sing, and you don't, as I say, if you're just coming back from the grocery store, if you don't mind, and here comes a wedding march and you barely know these people, you don't just stand there and watch. You put the groceries down and you get it on for a few minutes, because it's absolutely inappropriate not to rejoice with those who rejoice. And I like to tell the story here, and it's kind of a silly aside, but you will perhaps remember the story of a wicked queen in the Old Testament, wife of Ahab. Her name was Jezebel. And without getting into the story, she is unspeakably wicked, and you will perhaps remember how she died. Now, I will tell you how she died, because I have a point to make here. And I like to say that this is one of those Old Testament passages for which you may be hard pressed to find a flannel graph, because you remember she died by being cast down and eaten of the dogs. But the Bible is explicit that the dogs ate everything except the palms of her hands and the soles of her feet. And there is a Jewish midrash, it's called. It's just a kind of a homily on that passage. And it says that the reason that God thus graced Jezebel and spared the palms of her hands, the soles of her feet, because when she encountered a wedding march, she stopped what she was doing and she clapped her hands and danced. Now, I always think, I don't know how thoroughly advantaged she was by God's grace in that regard, but nonetheless, the point is that it bespeaks the fact that in this culture, a wedding is a time of such great joy, and you share in that joy. But I go back to it. The wedding march makes its way through the cities, through the city, and so on, wends its way, and along the way, the groom will depart. By the way, I'll just say this real quickly. The net effect, quite frankly, of this wedding procedure was to put the focus very, very much, very deliberately on the bride and her beauty, and she would be held oftentimes aloft. I have a dear friend who married into this culture in Jericho, actually, and she tells about how embarrassing it was. She's such a wonderful, comely young lady, but to be such the center of attention, but that's how it is. Everything is about you, about the bride. And so to kind of get the groom back in the spotlight, what they would do, and this was a fairly universal artifice or strategy, and it shows up in the biblical record. The groom would slip away with a few of his groomsmen. And so now, as they came to the home where they were going to have the feast, they would everybody would well, we can't start until the groom gets here. He'll be here soon. And so, and let me just say, and I love this. I'm gonna wander here for just a minute. But what I have in mind here, what's at stake, is a passage in John chapter 3, where John the Baptist is accosted by some of his disciples who are hurt because Jesus is getting bigger crowds. This is John 3, verse 21 and following, where they come and say, the one whom you announce is, all men are going to him. And John, one of my great heroes, John the Baptist, who had been the most celebrated, universally cherished person in all the Jewish world for some weeks or months. It's really stunning the degree to which the Jewish people of that day loved John the Baptist. Frankly, after they had rejected the one whom John announced as Messiah, they still loved John the Baptist. It's clear in both the Bible and in some extra biblical record. But the point is that John the Baptist, who had known that level of celebrity and fame and adoration and so on, was horrified when his disciples came. And so he picks up on this story. because to finish the story, for a time. So where are we? This is the day of the wedding. The betrothal was some weeks, months ago. They've made preparation. The groom goes, fetches his bride, brings her through the streets. There's been great rejoicing. Now they go to the place that's been prepared, but he slips away. And now, for several moments, maybe a couple of hours, the sun grows dark, and there are virgins, perhaps 10 virgins, who haven't been careful. 5 of them have been careful about keeping their lamps lit. This is what's behind that story. They're waiting for the groom. They know he's going to come imminently because we've been part of this wedding march. But the point is that for a few moments, the center of attention in the room where the feast is going to be held is the friend of the bridegroom, the same guy who had approached the bride's clan about her giving her hand to this young man. And now this same one, because he knows the groom best, becomes the center of attention. Everybody crowds around, says, is he coming? And you can imagine him saying, don't worry, he's coming. You know he's coming. I'm listening for him. And finally, maybe he says, wait, I think I hear his voice here. Yeah, this is he. He's coming. Everybody gets excited. Now the groom comes in and everybody runs from the friend of the bridegroom to embrace the groom, and the feast can begin and so on. Well, John picks up on that. John the Baptist, when his disciples are chagrined because Jesus has greater crowds, and John says, wait a minute. I wouldn't take anything more to myself than what God has given me. I've told you again and again, I'm not the Messiah. Then he says this. If you understand this culture, this will mean, I think, more to you. He says, and it seems like a truistic statement, but it's not. He says, all right, I got into it, so I'm going to take you there. We'll see what happens with time here, but let me just take you to, I can use this. John 3 and verse right here. He says, this is where his disciples say, Rabbi, he who was with you beyond the Jordan, behold, these all are coming to him. And John answered, he's horrified, and he says, I've told you again, I am not the Christ. And then he says this, and this little statement right here is so meaningful. He says, he who has the bride is the bridegroom. What is he saying? He's saying, but he goes on to say, look, the friend of the bridegroom stands and listens for him. So he says, I'm the friend of the bridegroom, and I announced his coming. And and you got excited about the fact that he was soon to come. But now he's here. Now, folks, go back to the illustration, not the illustration, but the historical allusion allusion, what we're alluding to historically. Go back to that and think about this reality that the friend of the bridegroom is the center of attention until the bridegroom appears. How inappropriate would it be for the friend of the bridegroom to resent the fact that all of a sudden all the attention is given to the bridegroom? We'd be horrified. And why? Why would that be appropriate? You know why? Because he who has the bride is the bridegroom. Do you hear what he's saying? What he is saying is, this is not about me. This is about the bridegroom. This whole affair, this wedding, he who has the bride, this is about him, not about me. And it's a huge privilege and delight to be the friend of the bridegroom, but he who has the bride is the bridegroom. So again, this is another place, and I always say that it's an Isaiah 14 Adamic propensity of any one of us to make ourselves the center of our own universe, even ministry universe, and think this is about us, not about us. He who has the bride is the bridegroom, and that's Jesus. It's all about the bridegroom. He has come to glorify his Father. So it's just such a rich set of ideas, but I lose my way entirely. Let me take you back to the point, and that is this, that in the matter of fact, I'm going to go back to the scriptures and take you to Matthew chapter 1, because I want you to see once again that just how important this is. That now in this culture, put it all together, marriage really involved 2 stages, very distinct stages, and the marriage wasn't complete until those 2 stages were over. And by the way, I should say this as well very quickly, that on the night of the wedding feast, they made their way through the city, they come, there's a feast, and of course, as the wedding feast concludes, I'll be very delicate here, but it's a perfectly honorable and noble and wonderful God-honoring set of ideas. But but the bride and the bridegroom go for the first time into the wedding chamber. And they know each other physically and sexually, and now they quite frankly look for evidence of the bride's virginity, and that will be celebrated and so on. So the wedding, which began way back, the marriage, let's use our terminology, the marriage which began back there at the betrothal, representatives of the two families coming together before a judge and signing a contract. Now the betrothal period, preparing a place, preparing herself, maintaining their physical purity and so on. Now the beautiful wedding march, and now the feast, and then the wedding chamber, the marriage chamber, and all of that together constitutes the marriage. But the point that I want to make from the record is that it was so desperately important for them to maintain their purity. And I could go into divorce laws and so on in this regard, but let me just say, let's go back with all of that in mind. It took me a long time to get there, but let's go back and read this sentence now, beginning right here. After his mother Mary was betrothed, that is, that initial judicial ceremony, after she was betrothed to Joseph, but before they came together, before their wedding night, she was found with child of the Holy Spirit. Now, this is the point I want to make, that there is a measure of angst that would have, it's really a little difficult for us, but for any number of reasons, not the least of which is our cultural inurement. We become culturally inured to premarital relationships and so on, and so it's just part of it. It wasn't, and it shouldn't be. And biblically, this reflects what the Bible demands. But for whatever set of biblical and/or cultural or historical reasons, the fact is that in that culture, it would have been such a scandal. And this is a little tiny village. And you got these two families, that of Joseph and that of Mary. And they have agreed that these two young people, they would have been rejoicing and the word would have gone out. Here's the thing. Several months ago, a message went out after the betrothal. And it went out to Nazareth and not only to Bethlehem, where most of their families lived, and to other co-workers and so on. This young couple is going to be wed. They pledged themselves one to another. That is, they become man and wife. And in several weeks or months, there's going to be a wedding ceremony. Oh, what a delight. You know what? Another announcement has to go out. And that announcement is going to say, there's not going to be a wedding. Mary is carrying a child. It clearly was before the wedding, because that hasn't happened yet. She insists it's not Joseph's child, and Joseph insists it's not his child. She's got some crazy story, but it's hard for us to understand what anger. Joseph's family must have been horrified. And it's interesting the way it says she was found with child. Let's put together the chronology here, because they were betrothed. Then sometime after that, we don't know how long, but it was appropriate, she went to spend that time with Elizabeth. Now the baby has been born, and so it's appropriate for Mary to return from Judea, who knows where, just a few miles away probably. Actually, no, I'm sorry, she's up in Nazareth. She returns to Nazareth. And we don't know how long after she got back to Nazareth, but when it said here she was found, it simply means she is showing. She can no longer hide it. She is carrying a baby. And we are anticipating her wedding to come in just a few weeks. And so you just can't overstate the hurt and the offense and the scandal. Now, let me go a little further here, and I've used up way too much time, but verse 19, then Joseph, her husband, being a just man. Now you can read that. It's a present participle, and you can read it as you can read it to mean that it was by reason of the fact that he was a just man that he decided not to make her a public example. I think it's better to read it the other way. And it's perfectly legitimate in the Greek construction. There are two ways to read this in the context, and I think it's better to read it, Joseph, her husband, though he was a just man. In other words, what Matthew is saying is, don't get the idea that Joseph was careless about biblical and Mosaic standards of morality and purity. Oh, no. But he loved this young woman. And so he determined not to make her a public example. Now, the issue of stoning at this day, and I think given the status, this is another huge theological question of the Mosaic system and so on, the theocratic system. It was neither possible, and I would say they were not required to stone her, as was true in the Old Testament under certain very, very carefully judicially determined situations. But the point is that he could make her a public example and thus exonerate the reputation of his own family. But he determined, no, I'm going to just simply write her a bill of divorcement. We'll go quietly to a judge and get it taken care of. But while he was thinking about these, an angel appeared to him. Now, I got to say this. You know that there is, I always say there is a critical, unbelieving, anti-supernaturalist community of scholars of various ilks who love to discredit the scriptures. And I always say the Gospels are their happy hunting grounds because you got four guys telling the same story. In this case, you got two guys, but they'll tell us here, this is so, these two stories, you know, Matthew has an angel coming to Joseph, Luke has an angel coming to Mary. And these are two traditions. They're contradictory. They're not contradictory. And when you put the story together, and this is why I love this concept of the fourfold gospel. Did each gospel writer write his own gospel for a specific purpose? Yes, but was the Spirit of God superintending in such a way that even providentially in causing those circumstances and those situations which moved people to certain gospelists to write certain things together, they form such a perfect, complete picture of the life of our Lord. And you have it right here. Because on the one hand, we do know, Luke does tell us that an angel had come to Mary and told her, and she consented to become and by the way, matter of fact, I can go to it here. Luke chapter 2. I'm sorry, Luke chapter 1 is what I want. I'm going to have to go back to it now. Right here, that in the 6th month, the angel Gabriel, the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, was sent by God to a city of Galilee named Nazareth, and you know the exchange. But he says, "Do not be afraid. You have found favor. You will conceive in your womb and bring forth a son. Call his name Jesus. He'll be called the Son of the Highest." And notice, well, and then she asks, "How can this be?" And he says that the Holy One, who is, well, the angel said, "The Holy Spirit will come upon you." Now, I'm not going to stop there. I think you probably know that story. My point is simply this, that Luke does tell us that an angel came to Mary. But think about this, folks. Think about this. And I don't mean to be indelicate here, and don't spend too much time at this. But folks, number one, think about the situation. This is a real situation. Here's a young couple. They're a normal young couple. I believe Joseph was young. I don't believe he's an older man who had been married before. I know all the arguments and so on, but I think there's every indication, never suggested in the scriptures, and everything about the narrative would suggest that in the course of time, this was just a beautiful relationship that had been formed and so on. And so Joseph is busy, and he's day by day about his profession, which I think is stonemasonry, but you can take it as carpentry. I said that before because Joseph is identified, and so is Jesus, by the way, as a tectone. And tectone means builder, most of all. And just because in Israel, you build with stone, I think maybe he was a stonemason, though there is very early tradition. I acknowledge that he was a carpenter. But at any rate, Joseph was busy about his profession. He was also spending a lot of time with excitement preparing the home where he's going to. And now his beloved Mary comes back from the place where she's been, and a few weeks go by, and somebody whispers and says, "What is with Mary? She's carrying a child." Now, here's my point. Don't spend any time with this. But you can probably come up with some stories of this or that young woman who did wickedly and found herself in the family way, as we used to delicately say, and came up with this or that. I'm not going to, but there are a lot of crazy stories as to how that happened, you know, to try and cover her wickedness, you know, a lot of crazy stories. Well, now my point is, forgive me for that, but my point is, try this one on for size. Is Mary going to go to Joseph and say, "No, I'm still a virgin, even though I'm carrying a child"? And in point of fact, the Holy Spirit came upon me. Is he going to believe that? Of course not. And so what's God going to do? He sends an angel to Joseph. Now listen, it's become very apparent to me that I can't get this done. Shame on me. But it's too much to talk about. So we'll pick it up again on two. I'm not stopping here, but I'm just warning you. I said that there were 3 ways in which I'd like you to recalibrate your thinking. And so I'm just going to deal with one this morning. And then on Tuesday, we'll return by God's grace. As the Lord wills, we'll go to town and buy and sell. But an allusion to James, by the way. But let me just come back to this. So the first way in which I want you to rethink it is that they weren't engaged, they were married. And you got to understand that in the context of this betrothal and wedding march. And it was during the betrothal period that Mary was discovered to be pregnant. And so how possibly could Joseph be persuaded that this was not a wickedness on her part, other than an angel coming and bringing a message to Joseph? And so he does. Now watch this. I love this. I got to go back to Matthew. So here we are. She was found with child, and I'm in Luke again. Where am I? I'm in Matthew. Here, right in front of me. See, I can't find it. It's right in front of me. Again, this verse 20. While he thought about these things, an angel appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take to you. Now, I want to stop here. Do not be afraid to take, I'm in the King James, Mary, your wife. Now, let me do something, and I'm making a point here, but I'm going to go to that same verse in several translations, and notice one little word that's different. So here's the NKJV right here. Do not be afraid to take to you Mary, your wife. Now look over here what the ESV does. Don't be afraid to take Mary, what? As your wife. Look over here in the NIV. Don't take home Mary as your wife. Take Mary as your wife. The RSV gets it right. Don't take, folks, that little word as, number one, it's not in the Greek. Number two, it throws the whole story out of joint, because it sounds for all the world, if the angel said, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, she's not yet your wife. So go marry her. But it loses so much of the dynamic. So let me go back. And this is one of the most poignant scenes. What the angel said is, do not be afraid to take Mary, your wife. Take her. You see what he's saying? Don't be afraid to fetch her. Go get her. She's your wife. You weren't going to do this for some weeks. There was going to be rejoicing, feasting. Won't be any of that. But go get her. Maybe you should do it under cover of night. People will cajole. They'll insult you. They may spit at you. There won't be any feasting when you get here. But Joseph, go get your wife. And I think one of the most remarkable scenes in the narrative, it's only implied, but it's there, is when Joseph goes and fetches his wife. And just let your mind just try and flesh this out in your own mind. Don't you think Joseph's family was upset with him? I mean, they'd already decided. He had decided. I'm sure he consulted with his family. I'm going to make her divorce settlement. I'm going to make, okay, fine, Joseph. But now he goes and fetches her. They didn't have the dream. They didn't hear the message of the angel. And Joseph is going to be just as hard pressed to convince his family that this is a supernaturally conceived child, that she is yet that Mary is yet a virgin, as Mary would have had trouble convincing Joseph. And yet Joseph does it. Now, I'm going to leave it there, and let me just say quickly here. Is my phone ringing? All right, listen. Let me leave it there. Let me sum it. No, I'm going to go to the second one, as I'm just at an hour right now. But I will say this, and I'll pick it up here. I'll kind of do Luke's strategy here, where he overlaps his gospel, the two accounts with the ascension. I'll pick it up here, but let me just leave it at this: that number one. So I'm asking you to recalibrate your understanding of the nativity story in 3 particulars. Number one, and with a mind to catching the angst and the emotion and, quite frankly, the anger and bitterness that would have been there. And so I'm saying, first of all, you have to understand that Mary and Joseph were married, they weren't engaged. But to flesh that out and make it three-dimensional rather than two, understand that that is part of a broad drama. And it's a drama born out of a culture where the whole business of betrothal, purity, wedding, delight was so ingrained, and the absolute high point in terms of rejoicing and delight in that culture. And when you read that little phrase, after she was betrothed, before they came together, she was found with child, and you put that in that context, that cultural context, you're going to see that there is so much there. And that's why this dream, this angelic appearance to Joseph was so important. Now, my second point, and I'm not going to develop it, but my second point is this, that, and again, this is just a kind of a bare reality that I want you to rethink. Joseph and Mary were not going to Bethlehem just to register for a census. Now, there was a census, and that is undoubtedly, according to Luke, what made it, what caused it to occur to Joseph that maybe they ought to just move back to Bethlehem, because that's what they were doing. They were moving back to Bethlehem. And next Tuesday, today's Thursday, next Tuesday, I'll give you some arguments that I think make very, very clear. They were moving back to Bethlehem. But the question is why? And the Bible is not explicit about that. But I think implicitly, even the way the story is recorded here, I think it's fair to conclude that the reason they were quitting Nazareth was because life had become virtually unlivable in that little tiny Galilean village where they had lived most of their lives, maybe all of their lives. We don't know at what point. Jews began to make their way up to Galilee about 100 years before Jesus. But exactly at what point these two families, one of Joseph and one of Mary, had relocated up there, we don't know. But certainly Joseph and Mary, that was their home. And now they're going to relocate to Bethlehem. And my suspicion is that it's become because life had become, by reason of, I think, all right, I'm going to say this and then we're done. Joseph, let's say, and I'm putting two and two together, and we'll flesh it out a little more next week. When I say putting two and two together, sometimes I say, sometimes you put two and two together and you get 22, if you know what I'm saying. So I hope I'm not getting more than is there. But my point is that let's just surmise. It's a reasonable surmise that Joseph was daily making his way to a little village called, not a little village at all, what am I saying, a huge, important New Testament town called Sepphoris, close by, just under an hour's walk from Nazareth. And he would go off each day and sign up with one of the supervisors. All work in that day was a day work, and so you go sign on for a day. And undoubtedly, he when he did, and this is just the way you did in sort of a makeshift guild, you would have a work gang, a work crew, and it might be people there from Nazareth who worked together, and they knew each other's work habits. They were good stonemasons, and they could do so much more together than any one individual could do. And so they would go and they would sign on day by day, and I wonder if maybe that work gang, they didn't send one of their number to Joseph and say, Joseph, you're not welcome to be part of our work crew anymore. You've taken to yourself a woman who is bearing a child which is not yours, which was clearly conceived before the wedding. That never even happened. And you've taken her as your wife. You've brought shame on this entire village. You're not going to be part. Now, I made that last part up, but everything about the story and the culture would suggest that they would have suffered that sort of ignominy and slander and rejection and so on. And so I think it's very interesting that Joseph and Mary, I can prove this to you biblically, I think quite clearly, that they were not just making a quick trip intending to return. Now they did return, we'll talk about that as well, but they were moving to Bethlehem. And they intended to stay there. And I think it's because of the shame and embarrassment and perhaps anger on the part of friends and family and villagers there in Nazareth. Now that's just two. I'm done. I got to be done. But so rethinking, as it were, the nativity narrative. And first of all, understand that they weren't just engaged; they were married, but there are huge dynamics to that. And secondly, they are not just making a quick trip; they are relocating, and I think probably because of the ignominy. And then the third one will have to do with the place of Jesus' birth, which really is a compelling element of the narrative. All right. Well, thank you so much. Sorry for the delay. I did have a little bit of well, Facebook Live fought back, and I've learned a couple of strategies. I thought I had it all set up, and it didn't work, and so I had to resort to those strategies. But thank you so much. God bless you. Thank you for joining me for these Bible studies. I'm having all the fun. There's no doubt about that. But God bless you, and see you on Thursday. We'll complete this story. Today's Thursday. See you next Tuesday, 10 in the morning, and we'll complete this story. God bless.